Looking at today's warm up, there are many different levels in which you can study ecology. One is at the ecosystem level, another is at the community level, the population level. We usually don't necessarily look at the organism level, um, it, just because, again, we look at the population as a whole versus one individual in the population. But again, that varies depending on what the research is. Now, when you're looking at populations, you want to take into account a lot of factors that categorize or characterize these species in order to understand what's going on with the population and how they interact with their environment. So, again, remember, a community is a group of different populations or different species. A population is a group of species of organisms of the same species. So you have the owl population or the snake population or the prairie dog population, and they're all part of the community. If we were just studying the prairie dogs population, then as we're studying them, if we looked at their population and saw it increasing or decreasing, we might take a step and look at what's going on in the community. Is there something in the community that's affecting? And if we didn't see anything there, then we could take a step even further back and look and see, is there anything in the ecosystem, the biotic and abiotic factors that might be affecting what we see happening with our prairie dog population, why we see it increasing or decreasing or remaining steady. Many times when you start talking about studying a population, one of the first things that come to people's minds are the energy relationships that go on, the predator-prey relationships that go on, the competition that might be happening within the community, or that either are either inter or intra-specific. So even the competition that happens just within the population itself. And this is a lot of times where individuals might start looking at a population for what's going on. If we see a population decreasing, one of the first things we might look at is, well, what's happening with our predators? Are there predators increasing that's causing the prey to decrease? Or vice versa, what's going on with their food source, their prey? Is their prey decreasing, which is causing them to starve and therefore a decrease in their population? So a lot of times we start with those energy relationships that we looked at last week. Then we're going to look at the niche. The niche is a species' role of way of life in an ecosystem. This includes its habitat, energy relationships, reproductive strategies, resource needs, tolerance, etc. A lot of times we refer to the niche as an organism's role or job in the environment. And this is really just looking at one aspect. The niche is really the entire way of life or pattern of living, if you will. And its habitat is part of that. But there's so many other factors that you have to look at. And a lot of organisms or species will specialize so that way their niche isn't overlapping with others. And that way they can get resources and decrease competition. So in this picture, you can see that each bird has a different adaptation in both its legs and its beak, so it can feed on different organisms. It has different prey species and therefore is not competing with other birds that live in the area. Okay, so its niche is centered around where it feeds, what it feeds on, and all this has to do with how its adaptations allow it to have these different options. Take a look at this picture. In your mind, or press pause, think about everything you know about this organism. Okay, now think about everything you know about this organism. If you had been in class today, your classmates had said earlier for the koala, well, I know it eats eucalyptus trees. It's found in Australia. They sleep most of the day because they don't get a lot of energy. One person brought up how their urine is highly acidic, and that has to deal with the eucalyptus trees that they're eating. And then talking about the raccoons, they eat everything. They're scavengers. They're found all over the place. They're nocturnal. So all of these were characteristics that your classmates came up with. Maybe you have some others. When we look at species, one of the first categories, general categories that ecologists will divide them into is whether they are generalists or specialists. And these words sound exactly what they mean. Generalists have a more widespread or broad niche. They will eat anything, live anywhere, they have high tolerance. Whereas specialists usually have a unique diet, are only found in certain locations, or maybe endemic to one location and therefore have a smaller niche. So in this case, the koala is our specialist and the raccoon is our generalist. When we look at, again, the niches of these organisms, the generalist has a wide niche. And this has to do with the fact, again, that it has a broad diet, can live in many different types of habitats, sometimes even many different biomes, usually just many different habitats or ecosystems. It tends to have high tolerance, which means that it easily adapts to changes that occur in the environment. Whereas a specialist, as you can see, has a narrow niche. It has just a small feeding habits. So it might only eat one thing or only two things, has a narrow feeding range, can maybe only live in certain areas. So it has low tolerance in that it can only live under certain conditions. And so we tend to see, like I said, a more narrow niche with the specialists. So I ask you, which is better? Is it better to be a generalist or a specialist? And here I have some pictures of generalists on the right-hand side and specialists on the left-hand side. So which is better, to be a generalist or specialist? Now, think about, you can write out your answer, you can just say it out loud, but defend it. And don't be giving me flowers. I want detail-specific, evidence-based answers. Go ahead and hit pause so you can write down your answer or think about it. You got your answer? Now, things to think about. With generalists, they can eat anything. Specialists, they are limited to what they eat. And so if their prey is no longer available. Generalists tend to have high tolerance. So if there's habitat destruction or some change in the environment or climate, they can usually adapt or change to it. They usually have a behavioral or physical adaptation that allows them to adjust or move to live in a different area. Whereas specialists are more affected by habitat destruction, for example, because they can only live in a particular area where their food source is, or they have a low tolerance and can only live in certain climates. And if that changes, they're kind of out of luck. Generalists tend to have more competition because there are other organisms that are eating what they're eating. So we tend to see more competition with generalists. Specialists, on the other hand, there usually isn't any competition when it comes to food or getting energy through food because, again, they have specialized to eat a type of food that most other organisms don't. So they don't have that competition factor. So which is better, to be a generalist or specialist? There are 5 other ways that we categorize organisms, and that helps us understand or study them and helps us look for different patterns when we are studying their populations. One is native species, another is non-native species. So native versus non-native. Native, and we kind of talked about these last week when we were talking about the cats. Native means they normally live and thrive in a particular ecosystem. Okay, normally live and thrive in a particular ecosystem. A native species may or may not be endemic. So, for example, here in San Diego County, the Torrey pines is an endemic species. It is only found here in La Jolla. It is not found anyplace else. Whereas coastal sage or the scrub oak, they are native to California, and they're found here in San Diego as well. They're found all up and down California. So they're considered native species here in San Diego, but they're found throughout California. They're not endemic and only found here in San Diego. Okay, so native species. I have an example of a native species on the left-hand side. That is the lemonade berry. And the lemonade berry is native to California. It is native to San Diego. Non-native species migrate into or are deliberately or accidentally introduced into an ecosystem. So even species that migrate into an area are considered non-native, not ones that we necessarily brought in, but due to habitat destruction or changing climate or just expanding their territory, they've now come into an area. Sometimes they're called invasive, alien species, exotic species. But the big thing is that just because something is non-native doesn't necessarily mean it is threatening or invasive. Okay, a lot of times when we say we've got an invasive species, that means that it's threatening to other organisms that are native and outcompeting them. Sometimes a species might come in that has no effect. It's just occupying a niche that was not previously occupied, or there isn't a lot of competition for. And so it doesn't necessarily play a vital role at the time. Other species, like I said, are invasive. And so I have an example down at the bottom of a non-native species that we see all throughout San Diego, in fact, all throughout California, that is actually non-native, most people don't realize it, and invasive. And if you can't recognize from the picture, that is ice plant. Okay, ice plant was introduced to California in actually the 1930s. It was during the time when a lot of people out of work, it was depression, and California was trying to get people to get jobs, give jobs to people. So they hired a bunch of individuals to plant ice plant up and down the coast in order to protect the dunes from erosion. Okay, in order to protect the sand dunes and the coastal areas from erosion, they introduced ice plant. Well, ice plant is actually an invasive species, and so it just spread like crazy. And actually, when it spreads, what it does is it creates this mat that basically suffocates anything that is also trying to live in the area. So all these native plants were actually kind of pushed out and suffocated and kicked out of the coastal area because ice plant was taken over. Nowadays, we've learned the error of our ways, and there are actually programs that work to try and remove ice plant. You can actually volunteer to go on the highways and go in certain areas and remove ice plant, which is super hard to do because of their root system. So that would be an example of invasive non-native species. We're going to talk more about invasive species later on in the year. Okay, so species can be generalists, they can be specialists, they can be native, they can be non-native. We can also classify or categorize species as indicator species. And you may have heard the term canary in the coal mine. If you haven't been listening in social studies. I think that's where we talked about it. So what happens in the olden days is miners used to take canaries or other birds in cages into mines with them. And when the birds stopped singing or died, that was a sign that the toxic CO2 levels or whatever other gases that they were mining for that were coming out of the mines, that those levels got too high and it was time for them to leave the mine because they would potentially die soon. So it indicated that the air in the mine was unhealthy. Nowadays, we have sensors, so they don't take birds or animals in to let them know. But the term still sticks. Canary in the coal mine provides early warnings of damage to a community or ecosystem. It's a sign that something's wrong, and these early indicators are telling us that there's a problem with the environment of what's going on. So indicator species. Most often, indicator species are amphibians, and that has to deal with the fact that their skin the toxins can go in through their skin. A lot of the toxins or pollutants are water-based and easily diffuses through their skin. frogs, salamanders, fish. We're going to talk a lot, especially about what's going on, some of the studies and research with the frogs when we get to our toxicology unit and we start talking about pollution and toxicology. So we'll talk more about indicator species then. A keystone species. You hopefully remember from biology a couple years ago, keystone species. These are usually apex predators, but not always. And they have a wide-reaching impact. If we remove them from the ecosystem, the result is a trophic cascade where the entire ecosystem fails. So, for example, with sea otters, if you remember again, sea otters are a keystone species. They eat sea urchins. If the sea otters are not there to eat the sea urchins will overpopulate and eat all the kelp. Once the kelp is gone, the entire ecosystem is destroyed because there's no food for the other organisms. There's no places to live because kelp also is a habitat. And the sea urchins, you just get this barren wasteland. Okay. Whereas if the sea otters are there, they keep the urchins in check. The kelp continues to grow. Okay. So a keystone species. We saw in the gizmos last week that wolves were a keystone species, and that when their presence or absence had effect on the rest of the ecosystem. On the opposite end, our last role that we're going to talk about is the foundation species. So if the keystone species are holding it all together, the foundation species is what starts it, okay? It holds the base. They shape the community or habitats. Kelp is a foundation species. When that kelp is there, then again, there's food. It changes the climate of the area. It provides habitat and homes. And we've actually seen in areas up along the coast where scientists have gone in and removed the sea urchins, in areas where they were able to remove the sea urchins from these barren lands, the kelp grew back. The kelp grew back, and within a few years, the ecosystem was thriving again. There were animals again. The sea otters came back. And as long as those sea otters were there, that ecosystem continued to grow and thrive. So it was able to actually recover from the trophic cascade that had happened once that kelp had been given a chance to grow and develop. Beavers, as they build their dams, they create ponds, which create new ecosystems and habitats. Elephants and bats, many animals are considered foundation species because certain plants will only germinate after they've gone through an animal's digestive system. And as they go through these animals' digestive system and the animal poops it out, now you've got fertilizer for the area. These plants will grow, which are providing food. And so many ecosystems, like for example, many areas in the savanna, it only grows and is successful with these elephants providing this service. Okay, so foundation species. Again, here's a picture of the trophic cascade on the left when the wolves were taken out of Yellowstone Park. When they were brought back to Yellowstone Park, then we have a rebuilding of the ecosystem, a recovery, if you will. And as you can see, the beaver had a lot to do with it as a foundation species. By them building this dam, it actually slowed the rivers down, which allowed the fish to gather, which now provide food. We've got more plants because the elk population are being taken care of by the wolf population. And so we have this nice, healthy, diverse ecosystem. When looking at species and looking at their roles, we will also look at their populations. Okay, and this is where we're going to be moving on to, is as we study populations, we want to look and see their population growth. Is it growing? Is it decreasing? What roles do their positions or their categories take in their population sizes? And as we study these population sizes, that also gives us a clue of what's happening in the ecosystem. One type of population growth is exponential growth, also known as the J-curve. You hopefully are familiar with exponential curves from math. Exponential growth is not ideal in nature because populations can't grow uncontrollably. There's always going to be something that limits it. So most populations will start off exponentially, But then what we see is that there's these limiting factors that will push it back down. So it can't just continue growing and growing and growing. And again, these limiting factors may be biotic or abiotic. We'll look at more of them next week. They can be density dependent or density independent. And basically, they keep the population in check so they don't exceed carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the maximum population size of species. Maximum population size of a species that an environment can sustain. So it's the number of organisms that the environment can support indefinitely. And that carrying capacity is set by those limiting factors. As a result, the population shows a logistic or S-shaped curve. Now, carrying capacity is not exactly marked like we have seating capacity marked in a building. And as a result, what we really see in nature is more like these curves, where populations will fluctuate over carrying capacity. Okay, so here we've got where we see the yeast cells showing a true S curve. This one is happening not necessarily in nature. This is with a petri dish. And we can tell that because we set and limit. Whereas in nature, you're going to see more variety. So here we actually have an S curve. If we were to draw a best fit line or a semi-fit line, you would see here, right about here, is probably carrying capacity. And these organisms are going to fluctuate over that carrying capacity depending on the availability of resources. Same here. So we had exponential growth, and then we probably have carrying capacity somewhere along here, okay, somewhere along 200. And the population fluctuates depending on resource availability. Now, whether a population grows or declines is partly affected by its biotic potential. Its biotic potential is the ability to produce offspring. And that ability can be categorized based on reproductive strategies. All organisms can be categorized as either case-selected or R-selected species. Now, again, an organism could be a generalist and be case-selected or R-selected. An organism could be a specialist and be K or R. In general, if we were going overall, most specialists tend to be case-selected species and most generalists tend to be R-selected, but there are exceptions to every rule. So for example, humans, we are generalists. We have a very, very broad niche, but we are case-selected when it comes to our biotic potential. Case-selected species are animals with long gestation periods and very few offsprings. So when they have a brood, we're talking like maybe 2, 3 max. Whereas R-selected species are animals that reproduce quickly. And so the way to remember that, R for rapid. They reproduce rapidly. Okay? K-selected, reproduce slowly. R-selected species have high biotic potential, which means that they reproduce with really large broods. We're talking, 10 pups at a time or thousands of eggs laid at a time. R-selected species, since they're having so many kids, usually have little parental care. Okay, so the parent lays the eggs but don't really take care of the offspring. K-selected would be the opposite. Here are some different traits related to R-selected and K-selected species. You definitely want to be able to identify traits both contain, and you definitely want to be able to, if I were to give you an organism and give you information about it, you'd want to be able to tell me if it is R-selected or K-selected species, just like you'd want to be able to classify it as generalist or specialist. And by being able to characterize and place them in these groups, then that gives us a better idea of what's going on with those species, with that population. So as then we go to look at its population size, and if it's growing or decreasing or what's happening with it, we then have a better idea of where to look for potential reasons behind what we're seeing. Now, tomorrow, those in class will be gathering data for everyone else. We're going to be doing something called a survivorship lab. So it kind of goes back to our generalist and specialist, case-selected, R-selected, and the different roles that species play. And based on their roles, we'll expect to see different population graphs. So those in class will be gathering the data. If you are not in class tomorrow, you will have access to their data. So it'll come after class, as obviously, that you will analyze. We will be graphing, and we will be using Google Sheets to graph. If you are not familiar with how to graph on Google Sheets, I will provide a video for you to watch. And then obviously you can come to tutorials later in the afternoon to ask further questions.